Today we're breaking down one of the most debated topics in American democracy, gerrymandering, which is the drawing of election districts to favor one political party over another. Now, should this be allowed? You decide. The Constitution doesn't say anything directly about redistricting, but Article 1, Section 4 gives the states the power to set the times, places, and manner of holding elections for Congress. And states under the 10th Amendment get to keep any power for themselves that is not specifically given to the federal government. Now, this means that states have the power to draw their own maps of voting districts for local, state, and federal elections. Of course, elections are important because if people cannot vote for a candidate to represent them, then there's no functioning democracy. That is why the Supreme Court stresses that all qualified voters have a constitutionally protected right to vote and have their votes counted. However, throughout history, not everyone had their votes counted, like people who were slaves or even freed black people, as well as women. That is why we now have the 15th and the 19th Amendments, which highlight that no person's right to vote can be denied because of their race or sex. Now, once it was established that everyone has a right to vote, the courts then had to consider whether everyone's vote is valued the same. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as a quick example, let's say that you live in a state that has 100 people and can send 5 congressmen to the Capitol to represent that population. Let's say that there are 60 Democrats and 40 Republicans in that state. In other words, 60% of the population are Democrats and 40% are Republican. If you were to try and make districts that reflect that population, then you would create 5 districts of 20 people each, 3 districts of 20 Democrats, and 2 districts of 20 Republicans, which would likely mean that you'd get 3 Democratic representatives from the state and 2 Republican representatives from the state. But what if the maps are redrawn? What if 5 districts are created the same, where there are 12 Democrats and 8 Republicans in each district? Then all of a sudden, the state would go from likely sending 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans to the Capitol to sending 5 Democrats to the Capitol and no Republicans. It's instances like this and others where it would seem that some votes just don't matter as much. Like in our example, the likelihood of a Republican winning a vote with the redrawn map would be small, so their vote just would seem to mean less. Now, the Supreme Court has made it known that voters who suffer from this kind of voter discrimination are potentially protected under the Constitution's 14th Amendment that guarantees any person equal protection of the laws. This idea that everyone should have an equally weighted vote is commonly referred to as one person, one vote. Now, to try and guarantee such fairness, the Supreme Court has ruled that legislatures must create voting districts using population as a guiding principle and regularly change those districts to account for shifts in that population. Although the goal is to make sure legislatures create districts equal in population, the court acknowledges that the districts don't have to be mathematically perfect and other factors can be considered when drawing maps, like keeping political subdivisions, maintaining communities of interest, and creating geographic compactness. Now, the court says these other factors are fine to consider because there may be good reason to make sure certain areas can vote together that are unrelated to population itself. For example, a state may want all people living around a large lake to stay in the same voting district. That way, they could all vote on things like whether or not to allow boats in it. These are the types of political considerations the court considers. But the Supreme Court, over the years, found it very difficult to decide how much political consideration is too much. Because of that, in 2019, the Supreme Court, in a case called Rucho v. Common Cause, said that because it is too difficult to say how much politics should play a role in redrawing maps, it simply will not say a voting map is unlawful if it is created predominantly for political reasons. Supporters of the current law say that it reflects what the founders wanted, which is for the politicians to draw the districts based on what their constituents want and need, and that court interference would take local matters out of the hands of accountable individuals and put it in the hands of judges who may be free from political influence or who can sway any decision according to their own personal politics. The supporters also say that this doesn't affect the ideas of one person, one vote, because while everyone deserves to have equal say in an election, that doesn't mean they are entitled to have the same vote share in their district as they do in their state. In other words, just because there may be 40% Republicans in your state doesn't mean you have to have 40% Republicans in your voting district. Now, opponents say leaving the decision of voting maps to politicians' own choices destroys the idea of one person, one vote. They point to what's happening in California and Texas as examples where both parties are actively redrawing maps just to gain political power for the parties that the governors themselves belong to. They say such actions make the votes of people from other parties practically irrelevant. So, in ignoring political decisions, the court practically allows unequal protection for people's votes. They also say that allowing political map drawing violates the First Amendment because it minimizes the minority political party's influence and is discrimination based on their political speech. Now, supporters would respond that the court's position does not allow for violations of the First Amendment because in order to do so, you'd have to be able to pinpoint the exact speech that is being burdened. And political parties have a lot of people in them that vote for different reasons. So it is an oversimplification to say that someone is being discriminated on for their speech if they are being looked at for their political views. So, should political gerrymandering be allowed? And if so, to what extent? You decide. I'm Brenton Goodman, and thanks for watching. Please remember to like, subscribe, and comment.